Good afternoon, ladies and gents. Welcome to the South Devon Railway. We're at Buckfastleigh again. Not quite as nice weather as we've had for most of our live videos, but at least it's not raining on us. So we're here at the north end of the site at the moment. As you can see, it's generally fenced off as part of our security measures. We did come up and open it up and unlock it just to be able to come up here and show you what we're going to show you with the carriages today. It's got the diesel rail car there, affectionately known as bubble cars. We're not looking at that today, but we might do one on bubble cars for you in the future. So we're just waiting for a few more of you to join us, and then we'll move over to Alan. Okay, we'll go and join Alan Taylor, who's your host again today.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again to the South Devon Railway for yet another one of our Sunday broadcasts. So I hope you're all sitting comfortably. We're going to talk mainly about coaches or carriages, depending on your point of view. We have some fairly historic vehicles on the South Devon Railway, so we're going to show you two in particular today, and if there's time we'll show you some of the others we've got here as well. We've got our old Wickham trolley here stood in front of the coaches, so we're going to have to dodge around this to get at them and see them. This is currently stabled here. This is used by the gangs that repair the track, the Permanent Way Gang. And one of these days we'll probably do another broadcast talking particularly about how those all work. Okay, out of interest, if anybody is watching us today from a long distance away, we had somebody from Tasmania last week, and that I think so far is the furthest distance. So if there's anyone out there that can beat that, please let us know. But we'd be interested to know where you're watching from, so just let us know if you can. Right, now we'll go down here and start in a moment, but just to let you know that things are starting to move. We are watching very carefully what's happening with all the government announcements and so forth as to when we might be able to reopen. But some good news. First of all, the Totnes Row Breeds Farm is due to open next Saturday. They're obviously one of our partner attractions, and we're wishing them very well with that, and we're in fact hoping to assist them with that opening. And also, more importantly perhaps, our own shop will open next Tuesday for the first time since lockdown, and it will be open Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays. I think the opening hours are planned for 10 till 4 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and 10 till 1 at least on Saturdays. You can ring up on those days and place telephone orders for collection if you wish to do so. If you're local, you could visit. Full social distancing regulations are in force. It's all been marked out and it's all ready to go. If you do want to phone the shop and place an order, the number is 01364 643 113. Okay, one other point, our fundraising exercise is now reached 190,000, so please keep the donations coming, they really are useful. Hi Adam, watching from Paynton, and Phil Stansfield in Malton Hampstead. Pretty local so far, and Liam Hebditch in Taunton. You're the furthest away so far. Right, let's go and have a look.
Yeah, Alan, I think we've got a bit of competition going on as well, because I noticed the chairman, Mr. Morton, is saying that you can't beat his total from last week for the distance. So
I wouldn't even dare try. Who would want to beat the chairman after all? What we are talking about today, and because of the sound, it will be better inside. I'm going to do a lot of this from inside the coach, but we'll start out here because some of the interesting things that can be seen on these particular coaches. Just a quick one, James from Surrey, Adrian from South Petherton, and Alan Luke from Sweden. Hey, that's pretty good. We're getting foreign. Now, these particular coaches you're looking at here were known by the Great Western Railway as super saloons, but sometimes referred to as ocean saloons. So while we're outside, let's just have a look at the construction of them. In particular here, just look at the side and you can see the way the side bulges out, because the Great Western took advantage of Brunel's broad gauge. That was built to a much greater width than the normal standard gauge, and as a result they were able to increase the overall body width to 9 foot 7 inches. Normal body width for a standard coach is 9 foot, so they gained an extra 7 inches of width on these coaches, which were built for first class traffic, and I'll talk more about that shortly. That extra width meant that the doors had to be recessed, as you can see on this side. That meant that when the door opened, it still was within the loading gauge. The other thing that they had was what are called bow ends, so that the end came out slightly to where the gangway connection is. And you can see that the gangway connection with the traditional Great Western Railway bellows gangway, and that's how they connected two coaches together so that you could walk through the train. Now, because of the extra width, it meant these coaches could only be restricted, or had to be restricted, to those routes that were built to the previous broad gauge. So if you come along here, we can see on the side, on the sole bar, down underneath the waist itself, if you can just focus on that, you can see it says not to run over the eastern and western valleys north of Wolverhampton, north of Saltney Junction, between Little Mill and Maindee Junction. Those routes were not built to the broad gauge, and if these coaches had travelled on them, there would have been, the consequences don't bear thinking about. Fortunately, the South Devon Railway was built to the broad gauge. That's why we're able to have two of these vehicles, and we run them. So I think what we'll do now, we'll go inside and we'll talk a little bit more about the history, but also look at some of the finishings in the coach itself. So we'll walk this way. Now we've actually got this coach inside our new carriage shed. I say new, it's a couple of years old now, but we had this built. We built it with a very useful grant from the local waste company called Viridor under the Waste Credits Guarantee Scheme, which was very useful indeed, and it's enabled us to keep these fairly precious coaches under cover so that it stops too much in the way of deterioration. But as you can see, that they are finished to a very high standard inside. Now, why did the Great Western build these? Because there were only ever 8 of these coaches built. They were built primarily for the ocean liner traffic to Plymouth. Now, what was going on in the early part of the last century, and just before I go on, Jonathan Fry in Clevedon, see my wife is watching from Bobby Tracy, and Richard in St Budo. At the early part of the century, there was huge competition for international traffic across the Atlantic, and of course it had to be ships in those days. It was well before the days of aircraft, or at least any significant airline activity. So the best way to get across it, in fact the only way to get across the Atlantic, was on the steamships. And I've just been reminded, if you've got any questions, please put them in the comments and we'll do our very best to answer them. So at the turn of the century, the London and South Western Railway and the Great Western were competing for that international traffic, but because the liners, by docking at Plymouth, were able to discharge the passengers there, which meant that they could get to London rather more quickly than if they carried on through on the ship. Hi Colin Wallace, SDR photographer from Totnes. Hope you're doing well, and Richard Dowes in East Sussex. So the two companies fought over it. In the end, they came to an agreement, and in fact, it was the Great Western took the mail traffic, which was almost as important as the passenger traffic in many respects, and the London and South Western took the passengers via their route to London from Plymouth. Now, you may recall that in 1902, the city of Truro actually took a speed record for steam-hauled trains coming down Wellington Bank at, I think it was 102.3 miles an hour, at least that's what was claimed. That was hauling the mail train from Mill Bay Docks in Plymouth, having met the ocean liner traffic arriving there. The Great Western, however, when it came to the 1920s, the international traffic arriving at Plymouth increased. In fact, originally, the first port of call was Cherbourg in France, but the Great Western and South Western eventually managed to persuade the shipping companies to actually dock at Plymouth, and then they both went all out for the traffic. The Great Western really won the day because they had the faster route, and they could get from Mill Bay Docks to Paddington in about 4 hours, which is shorter than the LSW could do so. Hi Mark Hallett from Mid-Norfolk and Cameron from the Spa Valley. Hope you're keeping well. So, having done that, the Great Western then hired from the Pullman Company of the United States, Pullman cars, to run a prestige train from Mill Bay Docks to Paddington. in great comfort. Well, the Great Western was fiercely independent, and of course the Great Western wasn't going to just hire things from people, so they decided they would build these coaches. These were the equivalents to the American Pullmans that the Great Western produced. So if we have a quick look inside, these coaches, they started building in 1931, and this one, 9111 King George, is actually the first one that was produced. And this one and the second one, 9112, were both fitted out by an independent company. So the fittings in this one and the next one along, which we'll look at in a second, are slightly different. But they were built with these veneered finishes on the walls. This one had burr walnut in between the windows. They were all given large picture windows, extremely comfortable armchair seating, together with each table fitted with a large table lamp. This is extremely heavy. It's a pity we can't demonstrate it clearly, but it's a very heavy table lamp, and the reason, very simply, was it meant it was stable and wouldn't fall over whilst the train was going along. The carpets, they put Wilton carpets on the floor, and as you can see, the capacity is not that great, but it was very comfortable. And the first class passengers, you had to have a first class ticket for a kick-off, but they had to then pay an additional supplement of 10 shillings. Well, 10 shillings is 50p. And if I said to you that the current day walk-up fare from Plymouth to London is £189, what do you think the fare would have been in the 1930s? If you want to have a guess, put it on the comments and we'll see who gets closest to what it would have been. Samuel Strong's asking if it's a Hawksworth coach. No, it isn't. It was actually designed by C.B. Collett, who was the chief mechanical engineer at the time of this in the 30s. But as I said before, they were officially known as super saloons, but most people called them ocean saloons. Bob Pickering watching in Florida. It's very warm apparently. It's warmish here, I must admit, but we've had a bit of rain, which is always useful. So there were 8 built in total, and remarkably 5 have survived. We've got 2 of them. This is King George, and Duchess of York is the next one along. And this one, the other 3 that are preserved at the GWS in Didcot. So we've talked about the boat trains, and of course the GWR took very great delight in using the slogan "Land at Plymouth, save a day," which was the way they sold this to all the first class travellers that were on that route. So who we got now? Rob Kitley, James Evans, and Stephen Lidd, Didcot GWS volunteer. Well, you probably know the 3 that you've got at Didcot, which are 3 other examples of the fleet. And I think some of those at Didcot have actually got a small kitchen area in them as well. Ours haven't. How many coaches were built? Someone asked. Yes, as I mentioned, in fact, there were 8 of these built in total. An interesting thing, they were all built as saloons, and none were built as brake coaches. They always ran with a separate brake coach. And if we've got time today, we'll have a look. We've got a Great Western brake coach in the next siding. We can have a look at that. So we've mentioned all that. You can see the way the other thing that they were fitted out with were silk damask curtains. These are not silk damask curtains because they've been replaced over the years. These things unfortunately don't last. But you can see the veneers on the ceiling here. You can see the veneers on the wall. And there are some differences between this one and Duchess of York, which we'll have a look in a moment. Okay, so we've the other thing now. So what actually happened when these were operating on the Great Western? They would form these up into a train. Often the train would be 8, 9, 10, 11 coaches long, because they would also include some what is now standard class accommodation. In those days, of course, it was third class accommodation. And the whole train would depart from Plymouth Mill Bay and would be given as fast a run as possible to try and get to London within that 4-hour period. Now, we've got a couple of photographs here which will illustrate there. For example, if the camera can focus in on that, that is a picture of the Ocean Express arriving at Paddington, and you can clearly see there's 3 of the ocean liner saloons there, followed up by what looks to me like a brake coach, and then the third class accommodation behind it. That was now, when it wasn't actually in use, it was actually stabled at Old Oak Common Depot at Paddington. And one of the things about it was that the set was always kept in immaculate condition by the carriage cleaners at Old Oak, and it was under the watchful eye of the carriage inspector. And for all the time that it was at Old Oak, it would be kept ready to move at a moment's opportunity, because it was used for a lot of special trains in between. And in fact, it was also used occasionally for members of the royal family, not necessarily the top royals who would use the royal train, but certainly some of the other members of the royal family would use these vehicles. The other thing that they were frequently used for was actually race specials to Newbury Racecourse from Paddington, and they were often to be found on that, again because of the sort of people that would go to those events. They were prepared to pay the first class fares. Ian Sells is saying the chairs look super comfy. Yes, they are. And I must admit, having dined in this coach on the South Devon Railway, when we haven't recently had it in our dining train. I'm afraid that it's very unlikely we'll be back to having dining trains this year, but with any luck they'll be back next year. We now have a slightly different setup for our dining trains, but if we can get these fully overhauled, we will get these back onto the train. I see DJ Davis saying don't forget to visit the SDR eBay shop. Very good point. We're opening the physical shop at Buckfast, but our eBay shop, go and have a look at it. We've still got a lot of stuff on there. Dave is the manager of it at the moment, and he's doing a great job. Thank you, Dave, for all you're doing for us. Steve Squires, hello, Steve. Hope all's well with you, and thanks for the compliment. Okay, let's move forward. Somebody mentioned the seating arrangements in the coach. It certainly it was very flexible, and as you can see, these tables were actually in two halves, so they could configure the tables to suit whatever was required. Ryan Skinner says, what sort of locomotives would have hauled these trains? Well, interestingly enough, the fastest runs were actually done with the Castle class locomotives, although you would get Castles or Kings working these from Plymouth. They would certainly be the top link express locos of the Great Western. It was the pride of the fleet on the Great Western. And it had, one of the other things it had, I've just noticed this up here, there's some sample luggage, and the luggage rack was actually an integral luggage rack with the curtain rails as well, so it was all neatly hidden, if you like, and again the sort of thing you would get in a first class coach. The lighting was also slightly Art Deco. In fact, I don't know whether we can see it with the light, but we'll give it a try, because this is the main saloon, and beyond over there is the small saloon. And you could actually have these closed off, so they could actually, there was a set of sliding doors between the two. And here is what was known as a small coupe. Now, it is quite dark. I don't know whether you can see on the walls there, but the clamshell style lighting, again, very much something of the period. Richard Downers, how long did the journey take from Plymouth to London? The Great Western would always try and do it within 4 hours, or around about 4 hours. And I believe the fastest run was 3 hours 50. I might be corrected on this, 3 hours 58, I think it was. There were cupboards here, which were, that some of them doubled as wardrobes for passengers' coats, but also for cutlery and so forth for the service that would go on, because they would usually provide a meal service on these trains. Now, of course, with transatlantic passengers, there was always a lot of luggage, so these trains invariably included a full brake coach, which would just be stuffed full of passengers' luggage. So we're going through now into Duchess of York. Now, this was slightly different. Now, I don't know whether you remember when we were looking in King George, the walls were just plain veneer. In here, there are pictures of Great Western Railway destinations, and that was the difference, because this vehicle, the first two you remember, were built, although they were all built at Swindon, it was an external company, I believe their name was Trollope, who actually fitted out King George and 9112. And in Duchess of York, which is this one, 9116, all the subsequent builds, so the other 6 coaches, were all fitted out by the Great Western themselves, but using materials from Trollope. So this was fitted out by the Great Western, therefore it was done differently, and you had all these big pictures and so forth. David Hicks, looking forward to visiting. Great stuff, David. We hope to see you very soon. We really do. I think we're all getting frustrated. We all want to get back to actually running trains rather than just talking about them. So this was, as you can see, this is slightly different throughout, and in fact even the luggage racks are slightly different. It's just a slightly different fitting because it was done entirely by the Great Western themselves. I've talked about the names. Every one of these had a name, and they were all named after the members of the royal family, hence all the royal connections. And it's interesting that even today they still have been used for royal trains. We used one on the one and only royal train we've ever run on the South Devon, which was when the Duke of Kent came to open our workshop extension. He rode in this train, and if we actually go back, I'll gradually swing round here and go back. If we go back into King George, this coach was actually used by the Duke of York's parents when they went on honeymoon. That was Prince George and Princess Marina, I think it was, in 1934, used this coach on a train from Paddington when they were taken away on honeymoon. And the Duke, when he came to visit us, was treated to a footplate trip from Buckfastleigh to Staverton, where he alighted to go to his next engagement. But he popped into King George in order to have a look at it, as I say, because of the connection with his parents, which was slightly amusing at the time because his various bodyguards and what have you were all getting very concerned because he made himself late for his next appointment, because he was far more interested to come and see what this was all about, I think, than go to wherever it was he was going next. And they eventually hustled him out after much huffing and puffing. Right, we'll now move on. Just how did we acquire these? In fact, both vehicles were bought straight out of British Railways traffic. This one was purchased originally by what was then the Dart Valley Railway Association. It's now the South Devon Railway Association, and it was bought for use as their club room in the very early days. Didn't actually get used for that for very long, but nonetheless that's what they purchased it for originally. The other one, Duchess of York, we've just been in, that was actually bought by the Dart Valley Railway Company as their boardroom, and I think they did use that as their boardroom for quite some time. Hi Jack Malcolm and Harrison from Hampshire and Dartmoor Rotary Club watching. Great stuff. Thank you. Always enjoy me on Sundays. Well, I don't do everyone. I'm trying to find different presenters, but there you go. So that's the history. These vehicles have actually been on our railway right from before we ever started running in 1969. They were some of the first vehicles to be brought up the line before it ever opened. So what we'll do now, very quickly, is if we can manage to get off and our cameraman can actually climb down safely, we'll have a quick look next door at the other coaches that we've got and just explain some of the differences between it. And I think you'll notice a huge difference between the opulence in this coach and the one next door. One thing I will just mention before we go, because there's a couple of other pictures here. I've talked a lot about Millbay Docks in Plymouth, which is where all the ocean liner traffic came in. So let's have a look at the picture of Millbay Docks. There you go. Now that's actually in broad gauge days, and behind it is the Duke of Cornwall Hotel. Now that is one of the few buildings still standing in Millbay, and actually is still a hotel. I've actually stayed there, funnily enough, and there is a little story here, and there is a connection between all this and, believe it or not, the sinking of the Titanic, because after the people had been rescued, the 500 or so out of the 1,500 that were on the vessel had been rescued, quite a lot of the passengers and pretty much all the crew who were rescued were brought back to Plymouth on a different ship sometime later in April 1912. When they docked at Plymouth, the White Star Line did not want any of the crew talking to the press or anyone else, so they hustled them out in secret. And of the crew that was there, all the men were given bunks in the docks waiting room and the station waiting room, but the stewardesses, 20 of them, were actually given rooms in the Duke of Cornwall. And the Duke of Cornwall, if you go there today, in fact, the interior is very much like it would have been in those days. It's a hotel that really hasn't changed a great deal. and it still has this connection to the fact that it was, if you like, involved in the sinking of the Titanic. But it's so there is that sort of bit of history related to it. So let's go and have a look at this other coach very quickly. Okay, what we're going to have a look at now is actually what's called a brake third. So this is what I think it often was a Hawksworth in the later days, but in the early days it could well have been. This is also a Collett coach. This would have been the brake coach that would have been used on an ocean liner train. So we'll have a quick look in there if we can climb up. Okay, so this is the luggage compartment of this brake third. So this is part of where the passenger luggage would have been stored from the people boarding the train from the ocean liners at Plymouth, and the guard would have been responsible for making sure that it was all kept secure. Now I keep talking about third class because that's what it was, and in fact there used to be, in the early days of railways, they had first, second and third class. But second class was abolished in 1910. And from 1910 through to 1956, you only had first and third. But then in 1956, a bit of common sense prevailed and the third class became second class. So that's what we had up until these days, where we have first class and standard class, of course. Hi, Derek and Sandra Blake. Hi guys, I know you'd like to get back into work in the buffet, and so would we as well. If the light will hold, we'll go down the corridor and just have a look at the accommodation in here. So all of these trains were corridor connected, and this is what the crew and passengers would have used to get through the train. The first thing we come to, that's the guard's compartment, and you can see the handbrake, the guard's handbrake, just only used when the train was stabled. One interesting piece of kit over here, the pasty warmer. That's where the guard would put his lunch, just to keep it warm. That was connected to that one actually is an electric one, and some of them were connected to the steam heat. There's the emergency brake valve. Now all trains, as I think I mentioned when we were talking about goods wagons, about the continuous brakes, if the guard spotted a problem or needed to stop the train in an emergency, he could push that lever up and it would empty the pipe with the vacuum in it and put the brakes on. In fact, what often happens if the guard needs to get the driver's attention because of an emergency, rather than do that completely, because that would bring the train to a sudden halt, the guard would just give a couple of taps on that, which would be sufficient to alert the driver, and the guard would then lean out of the window with a red flag. We'll just go through here and show you in the last few minutes, just to give you an impression. You saw the opulence in the ocean saloons. Here is a typical third class compartment, as it would have been. Now, compartment coaches, of course, and another thing that is we no longer have them on the mainline trains. They are very popular. Our visitors really like compartments. They're some of the most popular things that we have on this railway. Ricky Jarrett, hello Ricky, how you doing? I think you'd like to get back to waving flags just as much as we would. This particular coach has got 4 third class compartments. They could seat up to 6 people, and they could seat up to 8 people, and the first class compartments would seat up to 6. And the first class compartments would have armrests, for example. So they're getting a bit more like the ocean saloons, but the ocean saloons were definitely the cream of the crop with their freestanding armchairs and so on. But again, here you see we've replaced them with more modern reproduction pictures, but all these around the side of the compartment you've got these pictures of destinations and so forth, and that was partly to encourage all the users, all the passengers, to actually travel by train to all these destinations in Devon and Cornwall. Traditional luggage racks up here, and you've also got in these coaches the lighting, for example, these light bulbs. And there is a story that in the old days on the Ashburton branch, which is the South Devon Railway, The trains, there used to be a school train, or at least one of the trains became a school train that the school children used to use from Ashburton down to Totnes to go to school. It was a favourite trick of theirs to take the light bulbs out and throw them out of the window. They used to get into quite a lot of trouble for it, but it was quite a common occurrence in those days. Right, so that's it. There's a toilet at the far end of this coach, and there's toilets in most of the coaches, of course. In the old days, that's how these trains would run. Let's go back in this direction, because I think it's just coming up to time that we finish. So we'll just leave this coach and just say there's just one other thing I'll point out while we're here, that the guard did have his own heater in his coach, which he could adjust just to make sure he kept himself warm. And he also had controls for all the train lighting ready to hand here. We've actually also used this now as part of our PA system for communication on our trains. But I have to say, compared to the armchairs in King George and the others, and as a guard on the South Devon Railway, these are not the most comfortable seats. They may look it, but they're not. And if you spend a day as a guard, the trick is not to sit down too often, otherwise you end up with an aching back at the end of the day. I think we've more or less got to the end of our session today.
Should we go outside and just have a quick look at the shed as well?
Yes, let's go and have a look outside then.
We've still got lots of people joining us, so...
While we're here, look at these are in fact mail sacks. They're actually genuine mail sacks. They're not filled with genuine mail, I hasten to add. But in the old days, the trains, of course, used to be mail. I've mentioned mail trains in connection with City of Truro doing its fast run from Plymouth to Paddington. Mail was one of the things that was carried. It was a way of getting the mail around the country. Again, before the days of motorways and high-speed trucks on the motorways and so forth, the railways were out without doubt the quickest way of moving all sorts of things, not just passengers, goods and mail and so forth. Hello Francis, who works on Clan Line. Oh, including the Pullman tours, right? Oh yeah, based at Stuart's Lane. Okay, well you've got the genuine Pullman versions, not of course the Great Western versions. I don't know whether, did anybody actually, Stephen Smith, how often are these videos on? Well, we're doing them weekly at the moment. It's just possible we may drop them down to 2 weekly at some point in the future. We'll see how we go. I must admit in fact, that's a good point. If anybody's got any suggestions to what you'd like to see us talk about, because we're running out of a few ideas, and we'll sort of consider those. Someone asks, did this used to be the Dark Valley? Yes, it did. When it was first reopened as what was then preserved railway, it was the Dark Valley Railway, and it stayed that way up until 1990, when it was taken over by the South Devon Road. By then, the Dark Valley Railway Company had taken over the line from Paddington to Kingswear, and they found that to be much more lucrative than this, because they used primarily paid staff, whereas we were able to use lots more volunteers, which made it a viable option. Callum Nera, SDR Fireman Volunteer. Hi Callum. I'm not sure, I haven't seen anybody actually get the price of a first class ticket in 1930s. Well, in today's money, in 1930s, a first class single ticket from Plymouth to Paddington would have set you back £3.20. But if you think that there was also a 50p surcharge excess to travel in one of those ocean saloons, of course, it made it even more expensive. You've got to look at it in the context of what things were worth in those days. Thank you, Jonathan Fry. He said it's great to see a different view of the railway. Yeah, thank you for that. We'll certainly try. Just before we leave the vehicle, at the end there's some of the emergency equipment. All trains, no matter what, have to carry a certain amount of emergency equipment. There's an emergency coupling, just in case one breaks in traffic. Fortunately, an extremely rare occurrence. And in here, we have things like axes, hammers, rope and so forth, all there for use in an emergency should one occur. Now there's also usually a step ladder there, but you've seen us using that, climbing in and out of the coach. That again is if you got stuck in midsection, it would be a way of evacuating the train. A suggestion, shunting locos from John Morton. Yes, well that doesn't surprise me as a suggestion, and I think we have discussed that as a possibility. The John and Rodney show will be back to do diesels on another occasion. I don't think there's any doubt of that. Workshop from Ian Yolland. Yes, we have thought about that one too. We will see what we can do. Slightly more complicated because of the security on the workshops getting into that on a Sunday, but we'll see what we can do about that one. Okay, Track and P Way from John Cave. You fancy doing it, John? Perhaps you come and front it up for us. That would be a good idea. Yeah, that if we can find a good expert to prepared to stand in front of the camera, that would be a good job. That's quite an interesting subject, actually, surprisingly. Okay, let's just have a look at the shed before we finish. If we come around this way, you can see we've got a lot of extra fencing at the moment because we're conscious of security, so that we're trying to make sure that everything is as secure as possible, just to keep everything in good order. But you can see to all intents and purposes, it's a modern industrial building. But the whole point about it is it does the job, and it's a very effective way of actually protecting our stock. And there's no insulation to it. It is really just a weatherproof cover. Now, several people, when it was built, said, why didn't you finish it off? Why didn't you clad it all the way down? Well, that is actually quite deliberate. Deliberate for two reasons. One is that it allows a certain amount of ventilation, because by doing it that way, if the coaches go into the shed wet, it means that actually the wind, the air movement, if you like, helps dry them out. So it actually preserves them longer. The other factor here is that by doing that, we would do that anyway, but in actual fact it also helped with the planning application. And believe it or not, what we're standing next to is actually the main road embankment. But it's used as one of the fly routes for the protected species of bat, the greater horseshoe. So the bats fly down through here, and those open sides allow the bats to fly in and out of the building, which helped with the planning consent, and particularly on environmental grounds, because we like to think we are bat friendly here. Okay, folks, how are we doing for time? Okay, well, I think that's been today. We've talked about the coaches on the South Devon Railway. We've talked about wagons before. Thank you for all your suggestions. Stay safe, everybody. Keep well. We look forward to all of you coming to see us in due course. A few more comments. I see a session on 1400 class locomotives. That's actually quite a good idea. Ours is in bits at the moment though, but then we could perhaps talk about what makes loco work as well. The 1400s were of course the loco that was synonymous, if you like, with the Ashburton branch. It worked auto trains throughout its life. That's how the railway was worked. Stephen Lear, what's the story with Ashburton? That I think will take a whole session in itself. Suffice to say, there is a group trying to safeguard the route up to Ashburton, to possibly open it one day in the future. All I can say is that if they can do something with that, then we would support it, but it's something not going at the moment with a separate group. So hello Grant Maxwell from Midlothian and Bill Tyndall from Colwood. All right, Dean Forest Way. Okay, well thank you everybody for all those suggestions. Don't forget that our shop opens on Tuesday physically. Don't forget the eBay shop that's online. Go and have a look for that. And if you can spare any cash, even if it's just small change, our donations appeal is still open, and it's heading for 200,000. It'd be really good if we could get over that figure this week. So thank you all very much indeed for watching, and see you again next week.